In the spring of 1883, as Boston trembled with the footsteps of progress and the echo of its cobblestone streets, fear crept silently where the city's lamps could not reach. It was a time of change, horse-drawn carts giving way to electric streets, the harbour bustling with promise and the scent of human ambition thick in the air. Yet, among the newly built tenements and elegant brownstones in the South End, whispered rumours twisted like fog through alleyways. The murmurs centred on a single name, Eliza Crane. No one truly remembered when Eliza first arrived in Boston. Some said she married her late husband somewhere outside the city. Others claimed she'd been born and raised in the shadows of Charles River. But in the spring of that year, she was unmistakably present, a widow of striking composure who rarely left her stately home on Worcester Square. Neighbours recalled her quiet grace, her habit of humming low ballads at dusk, and the odd assortment of visitors whose faces seemed drawn and nervous upon departure. The story began on a Monday that arrived with clammy rain and faded sunlight. Arthur Hensley, a local undertaker, was one of few men accustomed to the grim realities of death. Yet even he, hardened by decades among Boston's lifeless, felt his stomach twist when called to collect the body of Eliza's husband. Henry Crane. The circumstances of Henry's death raised few eyebrows. Men drank too much, slipped and fell, took ill in silence. But when Hensley entered the Crane home, he was greeted not only by the rich, sickly scent of roses, but also by the eerie sound of Eliza's singing. Her voice was not joyous nor sorrowful. It threaded through the rooms like a warning. Hensley lingered in the entrance, uncertain, until she finally appeared, her eyes pale and unreadable. That meeting would haunt him for weeks, and soon the neighbours began to notice other oddities. Eliza, once seen as a pillar of dignity, started hosting gatherings inside her home, late-night affairs that seemed innocent enough by candlelight. But when Sarah Morton, a seamstress from the next block, was invited in to mend a tear in one of Eliza's silk gowns, she glimpsed something that left her chilled for days. In a back room, a pale hand draped across a velvet chair, the air heavy with a pungent, unfamiliar odour. The chorus of gossip grew louder with each passing day, but few dared to confront the widow directly. Boston was a city built on dignity and restraint. Its citizens knew when to keep their suspicions buried beneath polite conversation. Yet by the end of May, another tragedy struck. Joseph Alden, a known trader, vanished after accepting an invitation to tea at the Crane House. The police, ever cautious, made their inquiries, nothing more than a routine call on a widow whose grief was both fresh and visible. Eliza's explanations were precise. Joseph had left early, and she'd seen him walk down the street toward Shawmut Avenue. The officers noted the gleam in her eyes, the tremble of her hands. They left unconvinced, but with nothing to show. A city powerless in the face of whispered unease, watched as solitude thickened inside Eliza's walls. By midsummer, the only sound that lingered along Worcester Square after sunset was a mournful hymn. Drifting from the upper windows, a lullaby, neighbours would later say, sung not to the living, but to absent souls whose stories remained unresolved. What would drive a woman to sing to the dead? In a city brimming with secrets and shame, the answer was never straightforward. But as summer faded, Boston's streets would bear witness to a series of terrifying events that transformed Eliza Crane from a grieving widow into the centre of the city's darkest legend. The dawn after Joseph Alden's disappearance arrived heavy with fog, muffling the city's usual chorus of church bells and peddlers' cries. For most Bostonians, the day unfolded with an unremarkable weariness, the sort that settles deep in the bones during the tail end of a wet spring. But for those living within earshot of Worcester Square, something was shifting, a tautness in the very air, a sense that the order they relied upon was warping in unseen ways. Eliza Crane's house stood as both a fortress and an enigma. From behind its lace-curtained windows, she observed her neighbourhood's daily rhythm, while remaining oddly detached, separated by an invisible barrier of suspicion and unspoken grief. The city bustled beyond her front door, carriages rattling down the thoroughfares, dock workers shouting along the wharves, children splashing through the aftermath of the rain. Yet for Eliza, time flowed differently. Each day ran into the next, anchored by solitary rituals and punctuated by the spectral music she sang to herself. Around her, rumours swirled with increasing force. The simplest gestures, a curtain drawn too quickly. A candle extinguished at an unusual hour fed the narrative being woven in hushed tones across Boston's tea shops and market stalls. To the city's eyes, Eliza's sadness no longer seemed sympathetic but strange, and her solitude took on a sinister hue. The community's collective imagination filled in what reality kept obscured. Only a few dared to breach the threshold of the Crane residence after Joseph's disappearance. Among them was Arthur Hensley, the undertaker, who found his own curiosity slowly eclipsing his caution. He told himself he merely wanted to offer comfort, for he understood as well as anyone what it meant to lose someone. But beneath this noble facade lurked his distress, a nagging sense that something about Henry Crane's death, and now Joseph's vanishing, remained unresolved. In the late afternoon, after finishing his duties at the mortuary, Arthur approached Eliza's house, hat in hand. He knocked softly at first, then with greater insistence, as the damp air grew thicker around him. At last Eliza herself answered. She looked composed but faintly pale, her hair pulled back in a manner both elegant and severe. There was a distant note in her eyes, as though she were balancing the weight of the conversation before it began. Arthur offered his condolences for her continuing misfortunes, attempting to sound casual. Eliza's lips curved in a polite but faintly strained expression. She invited him in, her voice measured and calm, holding at bay the grief that others wore openly. The parlor smelled, as always, of lilac and rosewater, mixing with the less discernible undertones of preservation and age. Arthur's gaze lingered over the accumulation of Victorian bric-a-brac filling the dim corners. A porcelain clock, a landscape painted in shades of grey, and on the mantel, a photograph of Henry in healthier days. Their conversation danced awkwardly around the subject of Joseph Alden, but Arthur's questions were met with plausible replies. Joseph's business was faltering, Eliza explained, and he'd spoken often of leaving Boston for a fresh start. Her hands fluttered occasionally to her throat, betraying the smallest tremor. A flicker of anxiety or annoyance Arthur couldn't decide. Eventually, he excused himself, unable to shake his growing sense of unease. Leaving the house, Arthur was struck by the sight of a small scrap of fabric on the threshold, an embroidered handkerchief bearing the initials J.A. He leaned down to retrieve it, but hesitated, torn between a desire not to intrude and a budding conviction that his instincts were sharpening toward something unspeakable. He pocketed the handkerchief and walked away, the city's shadows lengthening behind him. Meanwhile, back at the Worcester Square home, Eliza withdrew into her inner sanctuary. In the privacy of her music room, she allowed her restraint to drop. It was here, among the scattered scores and oil lamps' flicker, that her voice grew in clarity and force. She sang not for comfort, but for the memory of those who had crossed her path, and for reasons that even she struggled to name. The habit, once innocent, had become something else entirely, a ritual that seemed to hold back not sorrow, but fear. The police, though increasingly aware of public anxiety, struggled to justify further intrusion into Eliza's affairs. Boston's constabulary was overworked and understaffed. The spate of summer burglaries and fires left little time for ambiguous cases built on rumor. Yet one young detective, Thomas Dillard, began to take note of the emerging pattern. Dillard was new to the force, still honing his sense for the city's labyrinthine social landscape, but he knew enough to recognize when two deaths in quick succession were more than mere coincidence. Working late one evening, Dillard reviewed the scant files available: Henry Crane's death certificate, accidental, cause vague, a missing persons report for Joseph Alden, inconclusive, and a collection of notations from patrolling officers citing the tense mood around Worcester Square. None of it amounted to more than circumstantial suspicion, but experience had already taught Dillard that the truth in Boston often hid in the margins, shadowed by privilege and reputation. Drawing on a favor from a family friend in the city's medical college, Dillard arranged to examine Henry Crane's body, still awaiting final interment at Hensley's mortuary. The post-mortem revealed little: significant bruising, consistent with a fall down a shallow flight of stairs, and a faint chemical trace that the medical examiner thought could be laudanum, a common enough painkiller, but an unusual thing to find in a man with no recorded history of illness or pain. Dillard filed the information away, unsatisfied. Outside the police's view, Worcester Square simmered as a battleground for speculation. Neighbors watched Eliza's home with open suspicion, peering with undisguised curiosity whenever she emerged to fetch milk from the delivery boy or purchase a new spool of thread from the grocer's wife. The city's social logic, rooted in propriety, found itself at odds with the darker possibilities now swirling around the widow. One woman in particular, Margaret Boyle, a well-connected matron, found herself drawn into the drama. Margaret was no stranger to tragedy. Her eldest son had been lost at sea 2 years prior, and since then she had developed a keen sense for suffering concealed beneath the surface of daily life. She invited Eliza to tea one afternoon, determined to glean the truth about her neighbor's mounting misfortunes. Eliza accepted, arriving at Margaret's home in attire that was plain yet meticulously arranged. Over weak tea and dry biscuits, Margaret prodded gently, prying for details not just about Joseph Alden but about Henry, about Eliza's early life, her marriage, her habits before widowhood. Eliza's answers were polite, distant, but tinged with fatigue. "It's a cruel thing," Margaret observed, eyes fixed on the fine cracks in her teacup. "Grief makes strangers of us all. Have you found a way to sleep at night?" Eliza stared into her tea, her posture straightening imperceptibly. "One does not sleep so much as wait for dawn," she murmured after a long silence. Margaret noted the choice of words, the trembling resolve beneath Eliza's mask of composure. It was enough to convince her that the stories making their way through Boston's parlor rooms were missing key pieces. Whether entirely fabricated, or more horrifying than anyone imagined, rumors, in cities like Boston, have a way of circling back. Days after the tea at the Boyle home, word spread that the police had questioned Eliza again, this time in connection with a new disappearance. Florence Weller, a laundress known among the city's working class, had failed to return home after a late delivery to the Crane house. Detective Dillard, weary but resolute, arrived at the house accompanied by a uniformed officer. Eliza greeted them with the same controlled civility, denying any knowledge of Florence's whereabouts. Her explanation, Florence had delivered linens as usual, then left for the next client, seemed plausible but unsatisfying. While Dillard questioned her in the parlor, the officer took a cursory look through the ground floor. Nothing out of place, save for the stifling aroma of floral incense, lingering over everything. Dillard noticed a notebook tucked under a stack of music sheets. On a chance, he asked if Eliza played often. "My mother believed music calmed the mind," she said quietly. "But I find it only sharpens the memory." The detective considered this, unsure whether he heard a confession or merely an exhausted woman's lament. The visit ended uneventfully, and with little choice. The detectives left. Outside, the streets looked unchanged. Wagons rattled by, children played. The heads of neighbors disappeared quickly behind curtains as the officers returned to their posts. But inside her home, Eliza's solitude pressed in with new severity. Every sound amplified against thick stone walls, every movement suspect and observed. She sang less openly now, her voice emerging in only the briefest whispers, unwelcome reminders of what could not be forgotten or undone. Yet Boston would not relinquish its questions so easily. The city was changing, yes, streets widening, industries rising, but some anxieties clung to its old foundations, refusing to fade. When a city sees too much pain, it begins to look for someone to blame. And so, as the days stretched into humid July, the legend of Eliza Crane, the widow who sang to corpses, began to spill out beyond Worcester Square, winding through every whisper and shadow until not even the sunniest afternoon could entirely banish the chill from Boston's heart. Unbeknownst to Eliza and her neighbors, a storm was building, one that would soon lay bare the truths concealed beneath the city's surface, drawing together the threads of grief, suspicion, and betrayal in ways none could have foreseen. By the time July burned thick across Boston, the city was holding its breath. Worcester Square, once merely a backdrop to gossip, had become a focal point in every conversation, stretching from bakery counters to the high-ceilinged drawing rooms of Beacon Hill. The mystery surrounding Eliza Crane no longer belonged to her block alone. It was woven into the fabric of everyday worry and fascination. A single glance shared on the street could evoke her name, sometimes in fear, sometimes as a cautionary tale. But for Eliza inside the fortress of her home, Every tick of the clock marked another moment of isolation. Her days lost any sense of normal rhythm, supplanted by defensive routines. She kept her windows shuttered until the heat made it unbearable, stepped lightly across the floorboards to avoid attention, and spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. The habit of singing to herself grew quieter, reserved now for the hours when even the city's persistent noise died down. In this fragile quiet, Eliza's thoughts revolved around memories, snapshots of her life before widowhood, flashes of Henry's laughter, echoing beneath the clang of the trolley bell. Moments in the garden behind their home, where the roses always grew wild and red. Yet guilt and anxiety pressed harder with each day, chipping away at these recollections until the recent tragedies overshadowed everything. Meanwhile, Detective Thomas Dillard was determined not to let the city's heat or higher priorities extinguish the investigation. He returned to his desk each morning, his inbox cluttered with routine reports, but his mind always returned to three names: Henry Crane, Joseph Alden, Florence Weller. Dillard knew Boston rewarded discretion and punished inquiry, yet he sensed a rare responsibility here, a case that demanded persistence when others might surrender to ambiguity. The officer's unease was shared, if quietly, by Arthur Hensley, the undertaker, who could no longer dismiss his suspicions as mere imagination. The handkerchief marked J.A. that he found at Eliza's doorway lingered in his pocket, a physical reminder that the boundaries between private sorrow and public danger were disintegrating. One afternoon he summoned his courage and visited Dillard, delivering the handkerchief with a trembling hand and an uncertain explanation. Dillard accepted the evidence with a nod, aware that circumstantial details often became meaningful with time. He sent the handkerchief for analysis at the city's modest laboratory, which stretched well beyond its usual means, to search for traces of laudanum, blood, or other telling substances. The results were inconclusive. No evidence of poison, but a small stain that might have been ink or wine. Still, the presence of Joseph Alden's initials was enough to keep Dillard alert. As the summer deepened, other voices began to rise in volume. Margaret Boyle, now struggling to contain her own anxiety about the spreading rumors, compiled a loose network of neighbors willing to discreetly observe Eliza's home for signs of further trouble. They took notes on visitors, recorded times when lights flickered unexpectedly, and quietly compared anecdotes from their interactions with the police. Margaret's motivation wasn't merely curiosity or fear. She worried about the community itself, how the mood was shifting from concern to suspicion to the brink of panic. She wondered aloud to her husband whether the city would ever recover if these stories proved true. What would become of us, she asked, if tragedy is always next door? Boston's wider society soon became involved. Newspapers, long hungry for the kind of intrigue that drew attention and sold copies, began publishing sensational headlines: Widow's House of Secrets, followed by columns filled with little more than speculation and rumor. These articles reached as far as Cambridge and Lowell, painting Worcester Square as a neighborhood haunted by death and scandal. Reporters lingered nearby, hoping to catch a glimpse of Eliza, but she refused all questions, her public silence only fueling their imaginations. The relentless scrutiny forced Eliza to alter her routines even further. She purchased groceries from shops 3 blocks away, sent correspondence through anonymous couriers, and practiced her music at times she believed safest. The songs, once a source of comfort, now felt like weapons, things others could hear and twist into new accusations. In the midst of this, tragedy returned, this time with terrifying swiftness. Samuel Archer, a printer's apprentice who sometimes ran errands for the Crane house, was found collapsed in an alley near Eliza's home. He died within hours of discovery, and though the autopsy revealed death by heart failure, the timing, another person with indirect connection to Eliza, could not be ignored. The city council, pressured by both public outrage and private fears, formed a committee to oversee the response to the Crane case. Their aim was not only to calm the population, but also to determine whether the city should pursue further investigations or let things rest. Voices argued in council chambers, some calling for police to intervene with greater force, others insisting on Eliza's innocence until proven guilty. Tom Dillard was summoned to present his findings. He spoke of patterns and circumstantial connections. admitting openly that the available evidence was insufficient for any formal charges. The council's response was cautious. They allowed ongoing surveillance but declined an official escalation. Dillard left the meeting with frustration simmering in his chest, but resolved to continue his independent inquiries. Meanwhile, the slow collapse of Eliza's world accelerated. Her finances, once secure thanks to Henry's investments, faltered as legal fees mounted and social relations disintegrated. Friends who once offered solace now avoided her gaze in public. Even church attendance became fraught, each sermon seeming more pointed, every prayer marked by glances loaded with questions. Margaret Boyle reached out once again, this time in the form of a discreet letter. There is a moment where sorrow must open itself to help. Do not let the city brand you before the truth is known. Eliza read the note alone, beneath the harsh light of her parlor lamp. She did not reply, but the gesture unsettled her, reminding her that resolve demanded both fortitude and vulnerability. Her pride was no longer armor, but barrier to survival. The social pressure was compounded by practical threats. One evening, Eliza discovered her garden trampled, roses crushed beneath heavy boots. No note, no message, only the clear signal that her boundaries were under attack. For the first time, she considered leaving Worcester Square, abandoning the effort to clear her name. But the city had made escape impossible. Wherever she went, whispers would surely follow Dillard. Sensing this turn, arranged for a second, more thorough search of Eliza's home, this time with the council's blessing and Arthur Hensley present as a witness. They combed each room with methodical care, noting nothing amiss except a series of old ledgers, music sheets, and carefully arranged photographs. Yet when they descended into the cellar, the air grew damp and tense. There, behind piles of preserved fruit and stacks of faded dinnerware, they found a collection of empty apothecary bottles, each labeled with the year, most now covered in dust. No evidence tied these directly to any crime, but the discovery fanned the flames of suspicion and fed yet another round of public debate. Eliza faced the Inquisition with quiet despair. Her interactions with officials grew clipped, her movements sharper, her days shorter. She began to wonder if truth would ever be enough, or if the tide of judgment had become irreversible. Meanwhile, Boston itself reeled. The combined weight of tragedy, rumor, and uncertainty pressed hard across its neighborhoods, leaving behind a city both fearful and fascinated, united only in its hope for resolution. And so, as August loomed, the name Eliza Crane became more than legend. It was almost an accusation. Every story, every theory, every retelling kept the flames alive. The widow who sang to corpses was now the face of Boston's collective anxiety. And as the summer neared its end, the city prepared itself for what many believed would be the final revelation. As August bled into September, Boston's summer loosened its grip, but the heat of suspicion lingered like soot in the air. Worcester Square, once bubbling with commerce and neighborly chatter, had quieted into something colder. Shopkeepers spoke in half-sentences. Watchful eyes peered from behind curtains, and even the sound of carriage wheels along the avenue seemed muted. It wasn't only Eliza Crane who stood on trial. It was the city's faith in its own civility. Detective Thomas Dillard felt this change in every step he took across those cobblestones. He wasn't a man of superstition, but he knew the weight of whispers. Once set in motion, they became a kind of truth no jury could dismiss. He spent his nights combing through the fading light of gas lamps, poring over coroner's reports, letters, even receipts from the local apothecaries. Every thread led him back to Eliza, never directly but close enough to cast a shadow. Henry Crane's cause of death still gnawed at him. There was nothing overtly criminal about a fall or a trace of laudanum, but how many coincidences did it take before coincidence lost its meaning? The neighbors had made peace with assuming guilt. Dillard couldn't. He needed proof, real and unshakable. Eliza herself had retreated almost entirely into solitude. She had dismissed her last maid, stopped attending church, and ceased responding to Margaret Boyle's gentle letters. What remained of her days was marked only by the rituals that kept her sane, organizing scores by candlelight, wiping dust from Henry's photograph, and tending to the roses that refused to die, no matter how poor the soil had become. In the evening she sang softly, barely audible through the windows, and yet enough to draw passers-by to pause, listening to a sound that was both mournful and serene. To some in the city, the sound of her song had become a marker, proof. They said that she courted death's presence. To others, it was the one thing that made her human. In the blurred line between pity and fear, Boston found its obsession. One evening in early September, Dillard decided to return to the Crane home once more. Officially, it was a follow-up on the investigation into Samuel Archer's death. Unofficially, it was his last attempt to confront the truth before the case slipped from his hands entirely. She greeted him in the doorway, her face pale but calm. The fatigue in her eyes was unmistakable, a quiet, unending combat between defiance and despair. Dillard noticed her hand trembling as she opened the door, either from fear or from the effort of pretending it wasn't there. "Inspector," she said softly, stepping aside to allow him in, "you've made this visit before. Has anything changed?" "Sometimes," Dillard replied, his tone even. "Things only reveal themselves after we've looked long enough." He walked through the parlor, taking in the familiar surroundings, the thin lace curtains, the carefully arranged piano, the faint residue of incense still clinging to the wallpaper. Atop the piano rested a ledger. Dillard's eyes flicked to it. Eliza, noticing, gave no sign of objection. He opened it gently. Inside were lists, names, dates, sums of money, small inconsistent entries spanning nearly 5 years. They appeared harmless at first, until he reached the final pages. There the handwriting grew hurried, desperate. Names he recognized lingered on the paper. Henry Crane, Joseph Alden, Florence Weller, Samuel Archer. Each entry came with a notation, sometimes a date, sometimes a simple phrase, settled, resolved, sung. "Mrs. Crane," Dillard said quietly, turning toward her. "What are these records?" She looked at the book without flinching. "Accounts of kindnesses repaid." He studied her expression, searching for deceit. "These names, these people, what did you mean by sung?" Her lips tightened. She exhaled slowly. "When my husband died, people came to me. They came with their burdens, their grief, their guilt. I listened. They asked me to help them let go. Sometimes words are not enough. Music does what speech cannot." Dillard's brow creased. "Help them how?" She met his gaze. "By understanding, by easing what holds them. Isn't that what the living owe the suffering?" Her meaning hung between confession and philosophy. Whatever truth existed there, it stayed stubbornly out of reach. Dillard left that night with the ledger tucked under his arm and a deep unease churning in his chest. Over the next days, the city's pressure mounted. The newspapers demanded closure. The council demanded results. Even Dillard's superiors warned him that obsession could taint judgment. Yet he persisted, revisiting every shop where Eliza had purchased materials, perfumed oils, tinctures, and the rare herbs she used for her garden. It was Arthur Hensley who finally offered an unexpected lead. The undertaker, racked with guilt over his silence, revealed that after Henry Crane's death, Eliza had personally requested a special preservative compound, a chemical mixture stronger than what most morticians used. She claimed it was for cleaning, but Hensley recognized the scent immediately. Carbolic acid, a sterilizer, lethal in high concentration. Armed with that piece of information, Dillard returned to the lab. Tests on the bottles taken from her cellar confirmed the presence of carbolic residue. Still, without proof of administration, the case remained maddeningly incomplete. September's rains arrived, turning the city dark and slick. On one of those nights, a small fire broke out in the Crane home, visible from 3 houses away. Margaret Boyle, awake from worry, was among the first to notice the smoke. She called for help, and by dawn, firemen had doused the flames before they consumed the structure. Eliza survived, barely conscious when they pulled her from the parlor, but her left arm bore deep burns, and several important documents had been destroyed. Among the ruins, Dillard found blackened fragments of the ledger, but enough remained legible to note one last entry, a date marked 2 days before the fire, beside a single word, end. The discovery shattered the fragile equilibrium that had kept Boston's handling of the case restrained. Within a day, rumors evolved into accusations, accusations into fury. Crowds began gathering outside the Crane home, shouting for answers. So strong was the public hunger for resolution that even the clergy found themselves torn between sympathy and condemnation. Confined to her bed and swathed in bandages, Eliza refused all visitors except Dillard, who insisted on one final interview. She did not appear afraid when he entered, only exhausted, as though she had already accepted whatever verdict would follow. "Do you think you've found what you came for?" she asked. "I found signs," he said. "I don't yet know if they mean guilt or grief." She gave a faint, tired smile. "Do you think those things are separate?" Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear but with the peculiar calm of one who has nothing left to lose. Dillard watched her closely, weighing every word, aware that her silence carried almost as much weight as her speech. "You believe I harmed them," she said finally. "But what if they came to me already broken? What if death was only the last kindness I could offer?" The statement suspended the room between horror and pity. It was not a confession in the strict sense, no evidence, no admission of force, but the intent behind her words unsettled Dillard more than guilt ever could. He left the house that day determined to protect whatever remained of her dignity, though privately uncertain of what he believed anymore. Within the week, the council declared the matter closed in absence of proof. The city, restless and unsatisfied, turned its appetite to new scandals. Worcester Square emptied of spectators, though few ever forgot the songs that marked its nights. Eliza Crane lived only another winter, succumbing quietly to her injuries and pneumonia. When the news spread, no funeral procession was held, only a small burial arranged by Hensley at dawn. Dillard attended, standing silent beside the grave, unsure if he was mourning the woman, the victims, or the part of himself that curiosity had eroded. In the church records, her death was listed simply as natural causes, yet in the alleys and parlor rooms of Boston, her name endured, not as a monster's, nor a martyr's, but as a whisper carried by the wind. Those who lived along Worcester Square swore that after her burial, the night grew quieter, as though the city itself had exhaled at last, and sometimes, when fog descended heavy over the Charles and the lamps flickered along the streets, a faint melody still lingered through the dark, soft, mournful, almost tender, a song not for the living, but for the memory of what they had done to one another. Once the flames had died, and Worcester Square began to sweep away its ashes, the world outside Eliza's home seemed ready to move forward. But inside, memories clung to every stone and timber, refusing to be erased by time or fire. Even after Eliza's death, the house did not empty of its stories. Rather, it became a silent archive, each creak and shadow a quiet stage for the truths and half-truths that had shaped the preceding months. Despite official closure, Detective Thomas Dillard remained restless. The ledger's remnants, the words Eliza had recorded with such care, and her final bewildering statements preyed on his mind. He had accepted the city council's verdict out of duty, but found no peace in resignation. No one had confessed, and yet no one had been truly absolved. The sense of unfinished business haunted his sleep, pulling him back toward Worcester Square again and again. Even when protocol no longer required it, Arthur Hensley, too, could not simply return to his old life. The undertaker's home, usually filled with regimented calm and methodical upkeep, took on a morose atmosphere. Hensley caught himself lingering over the details of each new case, looking for echoes of the Crane mysteries in pale faces and trembling hands. Sometimes he heard Eliza's song in his memory, the peculiar hum drifting through the parlor, and wondered if he'd unwittingly missed a plea for help, if he'd misread the signs of suffering for signs of guilt. Rumors shrank without fresh scandal to feed them. Yet when homes changed hands or new tenants moved into Eliza's house, they reported oddities. A woman who leased the upstairs rooms to young seamstresses swore she felt a constant chill no matter the weather. A merchant who tried to establish a small store in the parlor soon moved out, citing troublesome dreams and quiet that felt heavy as lead. Stories like these circulated among local tradesmen and clerks, not as evidence of the supernatural, but as lingering reminders that disaster leaves marks deeper than ash or scorch. Meanwhile, Margaret Boyle, burdened by her attempts to support and defend Eliza during her final months, redirected her vigilance. She became a steadying presence for neighbors who remained uneasy, offering tea and sympathetic conversation when worries flared anew. Margaret's own memories of Eliza softened with time. She recalled the woman's tired grace, her precise manners, and her refusal to explain certain things to anyone, no matter how they pressed. One afternoon, months after the fire, Margaret invited Detective Dillard to tea. They sat in the parlor where so many whispered speculations had begun, the air thick with late autumn scent. Margaret set aside ceremony and asked the question both carried, but neither had voiced fully. "Do you believe she did it?" Dillard stared at the fading light through the window. "I believe she suffered, and that suffering leaves strange imprints. The city wanted a monster or a martyr. What they got was a woman none of us ever truly knew." Margaret nodded. "I sometimes wonder whether all of us, left alone with enough grief, could become legends to our neighbors." The comment hung between them, a gentle defense against certainties. That day they agreed not to pursue further inquiry, not out of contentment, but from understanding that some wounds can only be lived with, not mended by investigation. As weeks rolled by, autumn's chill turned to winter's bite. The house remained vacant longer than expected, a silent ward on the edge of Worcester Square. City children, daring each other on grey afternoons, would turn their faces away from the gate, recalling stories of the widow's song. Yet nothing haunted the house, except the memories carried by its walls, kind of archive for the consequences of unchecked pain and the deep longing for understanding in a society obsessed by appearances. For the wider city, time continued its indifferent march. New scandals replaced old, newspapers found fresh targets, and Worcester Square settled back into the rhythm of ordinary life. But among those who'd lived through the Crane affair, subtle changes took root. A little more wariness entered daily interactions. Concern for neighbors grew more cautious, less willing to stir ancient hurts. Boston itself seemed older for it, as if the entire city had been made to reckon with the shadows cast by its own stories. For Dillard, the case's real legacy was its complexity. He kept a portion of Eliza's ledger tucked away, its pages not proof of a crime, but testament to how confusion, grief, and desperate acts can defy easy judgment. Whenever he stumbled on new rumors or wary glances, he remembered Eliza's quiet intensity and the city's consuming need to choose sides. There were days, too, when the city surprised itself with rare, brief moments of empathy. A neighbor's illness saw old divides bridged by practical help. A new widow was received with less suspicion, more patience. Small changes, perhaps, but enough to suggest that even devastating uncertainty could, under the right circumstances, produce something like compassion. And so, in the new year, the legacy of Eliza Crane lived on, not as a headline, but as a caution. The dangers of isolation, misunderstanding, and fear were pressed into the neighborhood like fingerprints on glass, visible only from certain angles, but real to those who knew what to look for. Still, on some nights when the city fell especially quiet, the faint echo of a lullaby could be imagined drifting along Worcester Square, gentle enough to soothe, ambiguous enough to haunt. With the onset of winter, life in Boston settled into rhythms dictated by weather and necessity. The scrape of shovels against icy walks, the haze of breath in frigid air, the constant battle to keep the cold at bay inside dimly lit parlors. Yet even as snow blanketed Worcester Square and muffled the city's restless energy, the story of Eliza Crane simmered beneath the surface, less as scandal and more as a lesson anxiously mulled over by those who had witnessed its unfolding. The Crane house stood vacant, windows shuttered against frost, a lingering question set into brick and mortar. The neighbors saw its darkened form as both a warning and a comfort, a reminder of what could happen when fear was allowed to build unchecked, but also proof that even the greatest paroxysms of public suspicion could eventually quiet. Some who had once shunned Eliza found themselves reflecting, in the long winter evenings, on the things they had not said, the ways they might have reached out before rumors grew teeth. Margaret Boyle, isolated herself by the rhythm of cold days and her own advancing age, grew introspective. She replayed scenes of the past year with vivid clarity, the nervous conversations, the wary glances shared over teacups, the rigid postures of neighbors eager to prove their virtue. She began a letter, not to be sent, but to bear witness, if only privately. "Perhaps I expected truth to come packaged as evidence," she wrote, "when all along it arrived as people's loneliness, mistakes and the walls raised between us. I don't absolve myself for keeping distance. Not after all I've seen." The act of writing became its own kind of reckoning. Margaret sought out those still grieving lost loved ones and quietly offered support, more aware of suffering's silent passage in the world. She learned to listen, to detect the quiet distress that so often went unspoken, and in each encounter, Eliza's memory surfaced, not as the spectre of a villain, but as a warning about the cost of indifference. Across town, Arthur Hensley continued his work as undertaker, changed by his involvement in the story. His respect for ritual deepened, as did his recognition that every story beneath the surface of loss was unique, often murkier and more complex than others cared to admit. Hensley learned to ask more questions of the living left behind, to look past the obvious into what pain and regret remained. He could never quite rid his mind of the melody that seemed to echo from Eliza's parlor in those final, terrible weeks, but he accepted it as a reminder of his own responsibilities, not just to care for the dead, but to recognize the struggles of those struggling to finish their stories. Detective Dillard, for his part, saw the aftershocks of the Crane affair ripple through his job. Far from fading into irrelevance, the questions raised by Eliza's downfall shaped his approach to every new case. He viewed the city's stories less as puzzles to be solved neatly, more as tangled problems of circumstance, grief and misunderstandings. When faced with unfamiliar faces and difficult testimonies, he drew on patience he had once lacked, remembering how easily facts became distorted by fear and desire. And yet even as lessons were learned and slowly embedded into the fabric of Boston life, a deep current of regret persisted, a sense that justice, true justice, remained incomplete. The absence of a villain or a martyr had left Worcester Square with ambiguities that no verdict could resolve. For some, the ambiguity lingered as a burden. For others, it inspired a cautious hope that perhaps their city would not forget so quickly, that next time there would be more listening, less judging. A longer pause before suspicion replaced compassion. Life began its slow thaw as spring approached, and the first green shoots pressed up through the city's graying snow. The stories about Eliza grew rarer in conversation, replaced by new births, new losses, and the endless march of daily trouble. Worcester Square remained forever marked, but so too did its people. In window-lit kitchens and on lantern-lit stoops, they passed on the lessons of the case not just as a warning, but as proof that every story, no matter how dark or uncertain, carried with it the seeds of empathy, if only one looked closely enough. If the name Eliza Crane surfaced on a bitter night, it was spoken not just as an example of what to fear, but as a way of remembering the stakes of silence, the true cost, payable not only by the one accused, but by the whole community that failed to see her clearly. And in the very earliest hours, as dawn crept silent and new over Boston's rooftops, a few old neighbors claimed they could hear, if they strained their imaginations, the echo of a voice barely above a whisper, fragile, melodic, bearing neither accusation nor absolution, only the memory of pain, and the hope, however slim, for something better. Spring 1884 arrived in Boston like a quiet apology after a bitter year. Snow melted into streets heavy with mud. The Charles shone with brittle sunlight, and new construction rose around the South End. The city moved forward, as cities always do, but beneath its industrious pulse, the story of Eliza Crane lingered in quieter corners. Businessmen discussed her name only in whispers now, as if saying it too loudly might summon bad luck. Young factory workers living in the nearby boarding houses traded half-remembered versions of her tale over cheap soup and bread. For them, Eliza's decline was both a warning and a reflection, a parable of how swiftly society could turn on one of its own, particularly a woman without allies in a city built for men. The South End in those days was a district of stark contrasts. Elegant brownstones lined avenues only blocks away from crowded tenement houses, filled with Irish dockers, German artisans, and working women stitching the city's garments by gaslight. And though the factories gave many independence, they exacted a price. 10-hour shifts 6 days a week, wages barely high enough to survive. Within this world, Eliza Crane's tragedy had been magnified precisely because she straddled its boundaries, too refined for the poorer quarters, too tainted by rumor for the upper class. Detective Thomas Dillard walked those streets often that spring, his coat collar turned against the wind, his thoughts returning always to the same idea, that the truth about people was rarely a single story. He found the memory of Eliza rising in ordinary cases, a missing seamstress, an unexplained death in a boarding house, and wondered whether she had been victim or villain, or perhaps something more complicated, something impossible to categorize neatly. His connection to Arthur Hensley deepened during that time. Hensley had aged visibly since the affair's end. When Dillard visited the undertaker's shop on Tremont Street, he found the man slower, quieter, but still sharp. "They call it closure," Hensley said one grey morning, polishing the metal nameplates for a fresh set of coffins. "But I think it's more like pretending not to hear the things that never stopped being said." Dillard nodded. "Maybe that's what cities do. They make us move fast enough to forget." "And yet you keep walking past her house," Hensley observed. "Habit," Dillard said after a pause. "Or penance," Hensley grunted. "We all have our rituals." Elsewhere, Margaret Boyle's health began to falter. The long strain of the year had taken quietly from her strength. Yet in her final months, she carried with her a mission, one she had shaped out of her regrets about Eliza. She joined an organization at the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, founded just a few years earlier, dedicated to offering training and fair wages to single women forced into factory labor. Margaret's modest donations and volunteer time went unnoticed by the wider city, but to the women who attended her lectures, she became a symbol of compassion born from scandal. At one meeting, when asked why she, a woman of comfortable means, had chosen to dedicate her time to the struggling working class, Margaret gave a rare personal answer: "Because we are all fragile narratives, one misunderstanding away from ruin." Boston in 1884 was changing faster than anyone could keep up. Electric lights flickered into service in parts of Beacon Hill. Telephones found their way into the South End's police stations. The city's progress looked unstoppable, its factories loud with promise and hardship alike. But even in progress, shadows persisted. The moral scrutiny of women living independently, the unspoken hierarchies dividing neighborhoods, the quiet tragedies that never reached the press. Some evenings, walking home, Dillard saw young girls leaving the textile shops near Harrison Avenue, their hands raw and eyes weary, and thought of what Eliza had said about music soothing memory. In a way, her strange singing to corpses no longer felt so monstrous to him. It had been her way of grasping for solace, of finding meaning in a world that offered women so few choices. One last attempt at tenderness in a city obsessed with propriety. By early summer, construction crews repaired the charred upper floor of the Crane home. A schoolteacher from New Bedford purchased the property at auction, planning to open a modest boarding house for working women needing affordable rent. When Dillard passed by weeks later, he found the windows open for the first time in over a year. Lace curtains fluttered in the light breeze. Children's laughter trickled from inside. The image unsettled him with its symmetry, life returning where death had once reigned. Standing at the fence, Dillard removed his hat and looked at the house one last time. The sky above was overcast, but the street smelled faintly of fresh paint and lilac. It struck him then that mourning need not be an endless condition. It could, with patience, transmute into something like understanding. That was Boston's true rhythm, not burying its ghosts but learning to live beside them. A few weeks later he visited Margaret, now confined mostly to her home. Her once bright eyes had dimmed, but her voice remained steady. "You've done what you could," she told him, her hands resting atop an unopened letter. "Sometimes that's all our city allows. Small healings." He stayed long enough to see her drift into sleep. Before leaving, he glanced at the letter on her desk. It was addressed simply to the women of Worcester Square. Inside, he later discovered after her passing, she'd written, "Do not let silence do what kindness could have done first." Months later, the letter circulated quietly among the South End's reform circles. It became a call for gentle vigilance, for communities to care before their fear destroyed another Eliza Crane. Years passed. The widow's tale faded into the folds of local law, softened by retelling. The Crane house thrived as a respectable boarding home, and eventually as a small library supported by women's associations. Its windows remained open every spring, as if to invite sunlight where secrecy had once lived. And the city, rebuilt and restless, carried on. Yet for those who had been there, who had walked Worcester Square during the city's darkest whispers, the memory remained, not as a sensation of guilt, but as a quiet turning point. Boston had learned, however imperfectly, That tragedy often begins not with cruelty, but with failure to see clearly. Sometimes, when fog rolled off the harbour and the South End's lamplight trembled against the brick, an old resident claimed the air seemed to hum, a faint tune carried through the narrow streets. Whether imagination or coincidence, it mattered little. It reminded them of the widow who once sang to the dead and of the city that finally learned to listen to the living. By the autumn of 1884, Boston swayed into a new era, buildings rising taller, trolley cars rattling with tireless ambition, and old neighborhoods once choked with secrets, now breathing just a little easier. Yet for those who had lived through the winter of Eliza Crane, her name lingered in private spaces, a memory too enduring to sweep away completely, a lesson carved into the city's collective conscience. Detective Thomas Dillard found himself returning one last time, beneath the amber canopy of turning leaves, to Worcester Square. Now the windows of the old Crane house gleamed, clean and full of life. On the stoop, voices of young women drifted out into the morning, their laughter ringing hopeful above the city's usual din. Dillard watched them a while, conscious of how time and intention had reframed a space once marked only by dread. Inside, the new proprietress, a stern but warm-hearted schoolteacher, welcomed each boarder with practiced kindness. Some nights, she sat in the parlor beside a borrowed piano, encouraging her lodgers to sing after supper, emphasizing harmony over the hesitant, solitary ballads that haunted the house in years past. She knew nothing firsthand of the stories the walls held, but was careful to keep the doors open, the curtains wide, and the darkness at bay. Margaret Boyle's passing that summer was a quiet affair. Friends filled her parlor with wildflowers. Her final letter passed hand to hand, each woman who read it feeling its plea settled deep. Do not let silence do what kindness could have done first. Among those present were young seamstresses, teachers, the occasional police widow, all finding in Margaret's legacy, and in Eliza's story, permission to look out for their own, even when rumors threatened to isolate them. Arthur Hensley, still overseeing the city's transitions in and out of this world, reflected often on how closely fate tied strangers. He walked past the repaired Crane house, sometimes pausing on cold evenings to listen as new laughter rang through the open windows. The bitterness and mystery of the past had not disappeared but softened, reshaped. He thought of Eliza herself, and wondered whether her tragedy had provided Boston a kind of sobering wisdom, or only another chapter in its endless struggle. Between judgment and mercy, the boarding house itself became a quiet symbol in the South End, a testament that wounds could heal, spaces could be reclaimed, and meaning could be made from pain. A decade later, women who once roomed there would credit the home with giving them their first sense of community and dignity in the city. Yet the story of Eliza Crane remained. For some, it was a reminder of how easily justice could be hurried, how loneliness could spiral into myth, and how a chorus of suspicion could drown out the softer, crucial melodies of compassion. For others, it was simply a story, a piece of the city's folklore that would resurface whenever fear threatened to overtake understanding. Detective Dillard, nearing retirement, came one final time in late autumn to stand before the house just as dusk gathered. All his years of service could not provide a single answer, only the lesson that people, like cities, are too complex for easy conclusions. He tipped his hat to the window, uncertain who or what he was greeting, and wandered down the avenue with the first brittle frost of the season crunching beneath his boots. That evening, as lights flickered on across Worcester Square and the city's breath clouded against the chill, the distant sound of a piano drifted out of the boarding house, blending with voices older and newer, someone striking up a song. Not a mournful hymn, but a tune full of gentle hope, woven through with laughter and the quiet courage of women who had seen both the harshest and kindest sides of their city. Boston endured, as it always would, etched by memory, changed by loss, and occasionally reminded that even a single voice singing in the night could shift the fate of a whole neighborhood. And in those rare moments when someone paused to listen deeply, they would not hear sorrow or dread, but the echo of stories lived, survived, and transformed, a melody passing almost imperceptibly from legend into the unbroken harmony of ordinary lives. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.